On my 18th birthday, my stepdad demanded I start paying rent in a house he didn't know I secretly owned. What followed was a war, not just for control of a home, but for the freedom my mom and I never had. I turned 18 2 weeks ago. It should have been a huge milestone, a celebration, a release. But instead, that day marked the beginning of a bizarre, petty war inside my own home. The place I've lived in since I was 6. The house my mom and I moved into after she divorced my dad and married Rick, my stepdad. Rick. Even just typing that name makes me tense up. He's one of those guys who always thinks he's the smartest one in the room, even though you can tell he peaked in high school and just never got the memo. He always carried himself like a man who had plans, but all I ever saw him do was work odd jobs, blow money on tools he didn't use, and sit on the couch shouting at the TV whenever the Cowboys were losing. He loved power, control, and the sound of his own voice, in that order. Growing up with him was like walking on glass. He never hit me, but the guy could cut you to pieces with his words. He'd call me useless, lazy, or moudier whenever I didn't drop everything to help him with some half-baked home project. He'd make jokes about how I wasn't his responsibility because I wasn't his blood. He'd always phrase it as humor, but it never felt like a joke. My mom, she tried. I won't pretend she didn't. But she has this blind spot when it comes to Rick. I think it's because he came along when she was at her lowest. After my dad bailed, she was trying to juggle a full-time job, rent, and raising me. Rick swooped in with his big talk, his strong arms, and his charm. And to be fair, he treated her like a queen, at first. Just not me. When I was 16, I started noticing something weird about our house. My mom and Rick always talked like it was their home, but anytime repairs came up, Rick always said he had to talk to the landlord. It didn't make sense to me. I'd assumed they bought the place years ago. We'd been living there for over a decade by then. One day, curiosity got the best of me, so I dug around a bit when no one was home. Checked the files in the cabinet under the stairs where my mom keeps all the boring adult paperwork. I was expecting a lease or mortgage under Rick or my mom's name. What I found was different. The deed to the house was in my grandfather's name. My mom's dad. And there was a letter dated 6 years ago, just before he passed, stating that the house would be held in a trust for me until I turned 18. That trust, by the way, also included a decent chunk of money, not millions or anything, but enough to make someone like Rick perk up if he ever found out. And now that I was 18, all of it, the house, the money, was mine. I didn't say anything. I don't know why, but I think I needed time to process it. It felt unreal. Like I was holding a secret weapon and I wasn't ready to use it yet. Plus, part of me wanted to see how long Rick would keep strutting around the house like he owned it. I kept my head down, played dumb, and focused on graduating high school. But on the night of my birthday, everything changed. We didn't do anything special. No dinner, no cake. Just Rick sitting on the couch drinking a beer and watching reruns of some car show. My mom gave me a card with $20 in it and hugged me before heading out to her night shift. I was halfway up the stairs to my room when Rick called out. "Hey! Now that you're 18, it's time you start pulling your weight around here." I stopped, turned around. "What do you mean?" He took a long sip from his bottle and gave me that smug smirk he does when he thinks he's about to drop some wisdom. "I mean rent, smartass. Adults pay rent. You wanna be a man, start acting like one." I laughed. I couldn't help it. I thought he was joking. He wasn't. "I'm serious," he said, frowning. "You're an adult now. No more freeloading $400 a month. Due the 1st. I blinked at him. "You want me to pay you rent?" "No," he said, shrugging. "Not me. This house ain't mine. But your mom and I handle the bills. You live here, you pay." I stood there in silence. My heart was pounding, but my face stayed calm. And I think in that moment, I made the decision. "Okay," I said quietly. "Got it. Good." He smirked again and turned back to the TV like he'd just taught me some important life lesson. Glad we understand each other. Over the next week, I didn't say much. I played the role of the quiet, obedient teen who had just gotten his first taste of adult responsibility. I helped around the house more. Cleaned up. Smiled when Rick barked orders at me like I was the family dog. Inside, though, I was counting the days. Because while Rick thought he was pulling a power move on me, I was talking to the lawyer whose name was on the trust paperwork. Setting up the final steps for the ownership transfer. The trust had expired now that I was legally an adult, and within a few days, the house would be fully in my name. Rick had no idea. That Friday night, Rick had a couple of his buddies over. They were in the backyard drinking, loud and obnoxious as usual. I overheard him bragging to them about how he finally got the little punk to pay rent and put his foot down. They all laughed and cheered, and I sat in my room biting the inside of my cheek to keep from storming out and screaming the truth at them. But I waited. On Monday, I got the call from the lawyer. It was done. Official. The house was now mine. That night, Rick cornered me in the kitchen. "Don't forget rent's due in 2 weeks," he said with a wink. "Start saving." I smiled. I couldn't help it. "Actually, Rick," I said calmly, "I've been meaning to talk to you about the rent." His eyes narrowed. "What about it?" "I'm not paying it." He crossed his arms. "The hell you aren't?" "No, see, the house? It's mine now." He scoffed. "What are you talking about?" I pulled the folder out of my backpack, the one the lawyer gave me with the deed and the transfer paperwork. "This is the deed. My grandfather left it to me. My mom's been holding it in a trust until I turned 18. Now that I'm 18, the house is legally mine." He took the folder like it was burning his hands. Flipped through it fast, his face turning paler with every page. Then he looked up at me, eyes wide. "You're lying." "Nope. You can call the lawyer if you want. I already paid the property taxes too. Got the receipt." He just stood there for a moment, breathing hard, the color draining from his face. "I'm not going anywhere," he said finally, voice low and shaky. "I didn't say you had to. Yet." His expression changed, anger, then confusion, then fear. It was like watching a wall crumble. "I don't want to make this ugly," I told him. "I'm not trying to kick anyone out. But you don't get to push me around anymore. You don't get to demand rent. This is my house. If anything, you should be paying me." He opened his mouth to say something, probably some insult or threat, but nothing came out. Just air. I walked away and went upstairs to my room. My mom came home an hour later, and I could hear Rick whisper yelling to her about what I'd done. I waited for her to come storming up the stairs too, but she didn't. She came to my door gently and knocked. We talked for hours. Turns out she knew. She knew the house would be mine eventually, but she didn't know it would be this soon. She'd always thought Rick would calm down, or grow up before it got to this point. I told her I wasn't trying to hurt her, but I couldn't live like this anymore, walking on eggshells in a house I technically owned. She didn't cry. She just sat there and nodded a lot. When she left my room, Rick didn't say a word to me. Not that night. Not the next. But things were about to change, fast. Because if Rick thought that being on my bad side before was inconvenient, he had no idea what was coming. The silence from Rick didn't last long. For the first few days after I dropped the bomb about owning the house, he kept his distance. It was honestly surreal. No snide remarks, no barking orders, not even one of his obnoxious throat-clearing sounds he always made when he wanted attention. He walked around like a guy trying to figure out if the floor beneath him was still solid. Mom stayed neutral. She was clearly caught between trying to keep the peace and processing everything herself. She didn't defend Rick like I worried she might. But she didn't jump to my side either. She was mostly just tired. I think years of tiptoeing around his ego had worn her down more than she realized. But Rick? He wasn't done. I should have known. It started small. He accidentally left the trash overflowing and then loudly complained when I didn't take it out. Then it was his passive-aggressive sighs whenever I used the washing machine too long. I'd walk into the kitchen and find the fridge rearranged, like he was trying to mark his territory with condiment bottles. Every little thing I did, turning on the thermostat, using the garage, parking in the driveway, suddenly became an issue. Then came the toolbox. One night, I walked into the garage to grab a wrench. I was working on a small project in my room, fixing an old gaming chair, and I noticed the big red Craftsman toolbox Rick kept on the workbench was locked up. Like, padlocked. He'd never locked it before. In fact, I was the only one who really used it. Rick talked a big game about being a Mr. Fix-It, but I was the one who actually kept the house running. I found him on the couch and asked, "Hey, did you lock the toolbox?" He didn't even look away from the TV. "Yep." "Why?" "You want tools? Buy your own. That stuff's mine." I stared at him. "We live in the same house." "No," he said, finally turning to face me with a smug grin. "You live in my house, remember? Or wait, is it your house now? I forget. Depends on the day, right?" And there it was. The mask was off. I didn't say anything. I just turned around and walked away. But inside, I was fuming. Not because he locked a toolbox. That didn't matter. What got under my skin was the tone. That smug, condescending superiority he always carried around like it was part of his DNA. He still thought he had some kind of power over me. That's when I made my decision. If he wanted to act like a tenant from hell, fine. I'd treat him like one. The next day, I drafted up a rental agreement, one of those free templates online. I outlined terms. Rent. Utility contributions. Behavior clauses. A standard month-to-month lease. Then I emailed it to myself, printed 2 copies, and stuck one in an envelope with his name on it. I left it on the kitchen table right next to his coffee mug. Around 10 a.m., I got a text while I was at work. What the hell is this? I replied simply, your lease. Sign and return by the 1st, or find a new place. No response. When I got home that night, he was waiting. He had the paper in his hand, crumpled up, like it personally offended him. You think this is funny, he said, holding it out like a piece of garbage. Not really, I said, putting down my backpack. It's standard stuff. I'm not signing this, bulls. He stopped, took a deep breath. This is my house. I've been paying bills here since before you knew how to tie your shoes. You've been paying bills. But I own the house now, I said, calmly. Legally. Your name's not on the deed. You're living here rent-free. I pay for groceries. I fix things. You locked up the toolbox. That shut him up for a second. I'm giving you the chance to stay, I continued. I could have gone straight to an eviction notice, but I didn't. I'm not trying to screw you over. But you can't keep walking around here like you're in charge. Either pay your share and act like a grown man, or leave. He crumpled the paper even tighter in his fist and stormed off without saying another word. That night, he slammed every door he touched. He pouted like a child. Didn't come to dinner. Didn't speak to Mom. The tension in the house was thick enough to chew. The next day, I woke up to the sound of hammering. I ran downstairs thinking maybe something was broken. What I saw nearly made me laugh out loud. Rick was building a partition wall in the garage. A literal wall. Like some crappy plywood divider, nailed halfway across the garage to split it into his side and my side. He had cleared out half the space and stacked boxes along the wall like some kind of weird barricade. What the hell are you doing? I asked. He didn't even turn around. You want to be a landlord? Fine. Then this is my unit. Don't come on my side. Rick, you're not building a war bunker in my garage. He turned around with that same smug grin. Oh, but it's our garage, right? No, actually. It's on the property deed. So it's mine. You said you wanted peace, kid. I'm giving you boundaries. Stay on your side. I'll stay on mine. It was honestly pathetic. Like watching a toddler build a fort out of couch cushions and then declare sovereignty. But fine. Let him have his wall. Things just kept escalating from there. He started passive-aggressively unplugging the Wi-Fi router when I was using it, claiming it was slowing down his shows. He accidentally left dirty dishes in the sink for days. Once, I came home to find he'd moved my laundry out of the washer and into a basket, soaking wet, just so he could wash one shirt. When I confronted him, he just grinned and said, "Guess you better put some rules in that lease, huh?" So I did. I updated the lease. Added a shared resources clause. Outlined the Wi-Fi policy, laundry room access hours, kitchen use schedules. Reprinted it. Slid it under his door. Still no signature. 2 more weeks went by. I kept quiet, logged everything. Every time he unplugged the router, logged it. Every time he yelled at my mom, logged it. Every time he entered my room without knocking, moved my stuff, or used my things without asking, logged it. Then I called a lawyer. A family friend, the same guy who handled the trust transfer. I explained the situation. Asked if I was within my rights to evict Rick if he refused to pay or sign a lease. He chuckled. He's not your dad, right? Stepdad. Then yes. Especially if your mom doesn't have any ownership. If he's not contributing and you have documentation of hostile behavior, you're good to go. I filed a formal eviction notice the next day. Mom was devastated when I told her. I felt awful, but I had to explain it the way it was. He doesn't respect me. He doesn't respect the house. And I can't live like this. She didn't argue. Just cried quietly and nodded. I could tell it killed her, not because she didn't understand, but because she did. The notice gave him 30 days. He had no lease, no claim to the property, and no right to squat. I left a copy taped to his garage wall. The next morning, I woke up to yelling. Rick was in the kitchen, waving the paper in front of my mom like it was a court summons. His face was beet red. He can't do this. This is my home. I built that fence out back. My mom looked tired. Like she hadn't slept. She didn't even argue. I walked in and stood next to her. You have 30 days, Rick, I said. That's the law. He turned to me with pure venom in his eyes. You're ruining this family. No, I said. You did that a long time ago. And I walked out the front door. I had never felt so free. But I also knew this wasn't the end. Because Rick wasn't the kind of guy to go quietly. Rick had 29 days left. That eviction notice hit him like a slap across the face, but instead of waking him up, it just made him meaner. Louder. Pettier. If he couldn't have power, he'd settle for chaos. I should have expected it, but I still wasn't fully ready for the stunt he pulled next. He started weaponizing Mom. Not physically, obviously. But emotionally, manipulatively. He'd start fights with her over nothing, then pivot them into these long, teary monologues about how I was tearing the family apart. One night I came home and heard him loudly sobbing in the living room, like loudly, the kind of over-the-top dramatic crying you hear in bad movies. When I walked in, he didn't even flinch. Just take everything, why don't you, he shouted at me, arms thrown wide like some tragic Shakespeare character. Take the house, take your mother, take my dignity. Mom was just sitting on the couch with a blank stare, looking like she was somewhere else entirely. I quietly asked her if she was okay, and she just nodded, eyes red. He'd been doing this every day while I was at work. Cornering her, guilt-tripping her, crying about how she was choosing the kid over her man. She never defended me, but she didn't back him up either. I think she was just exhausted. Stuck. And maybe part of her did feel guilty. Like this whole situation, the trust, the ownership, was something she could have managed better if she had more control in her own life. But she didn't. Rick had been steering this ship for years, and now he was crashing it out of spite. By the end of the week, he'd moved into the garage full-time. He turned his little plywood wall into a sad bachelor pad. Hauled out an air mattress, a mini fridge, even dragged the old box TV out there. I guess this was his way of protesting, refusing to live under my roof, even though technically the entire property was my roof. He refused to speak to me directly after that. Everything was through Mom. He'd say things like tell your son the trash can is full, or pass the boy to stop leaving the porch light on all night. I ignored most of it. But it wore on her. Every day I watched her shrink a little more, emotionally curling up like a wilted plant between two heat lamps. Then came the utilities stunt. I came home from work one night and noticed the Wi-Fi was down. Again. Except this time, it wasn't just the router, the whole modem had been unplugged and taken. I checked the breaker box and saw the labels had been scratched out. I flipped switches until the internet came back on. A few minutes later, the whole house went dark. He'd shut off the main breaker. I found him in the garage with a smug look and a lawn chair pulled up like he was enjoying a sunset. This is petty, I said. So's evicting your own family, he replied. You're not my family, Rick. His eyes flashed with that pure how dare you'd energy. Your mom and I have been married over a decade. I raised you. No, I said flatly. You lived in the same house as me. There's a difference. He stood up like he wanted to charge me. But he stopped. Because we both knew I was calm. I had power. I wasn't shouting. I wasn't losing it. And that scared him more than anything. 30 days, I said. You've got 22 left. Keep playing these games, and I'll have the cops escort you out early. He didn't say a word. Just flipped me off and turned back to his chair. That night, I put a lock on the breaker box. Then I called a locksmith and changed every single door lock in the house, just in case Rick got it in his head to try something while I was gone. It was a pain, and expensive, but worth the peace of mind. I gave my mom a key. I didn't give Rick one. He had to knock to get inside. He didn't knock. He banged. Kicked. Screamed. You're locking me out of my own home, he shouted one night. This is illegal. No, it's not, I said through the door. You're a guest. A guest being evicted. Your mother will never forgive you. That made me pause. Because I knew, deep down, that this was what he was really trying to do, wedge himself between us. Turn this into me versus her. And it was starting to work. That weekend, she sat me down at the kitchen table. He's not going to leave peacefully, she said softly. I know. She looked at me, tears forming. And I don't know where he'll go. I didn't say anything. Maybe, she said, maybe we can just pause things. Give him time. Let things cool off. He had time, I said. Years of it. And he used it to make both our lives miserable. She winced. He wasn't always like this. Maybe not, I agreed. But this is who he is now. And I'm done pretending it's normal. She broke down then. Full sobs. It hurt to watch. She was grieving something, maybe the man she thought she married, maybe the life she thought she'd have. I didn't interrupt her. I just let her cry. After a few minutes, she looked up. I'm sorry, she whispered. I nodded. Me too. Then, quietly, she added, you're doing the right thing. I swear, that one sentence nearly shattered me. Because I wasn't sure anymore. Rick was a parasite, yes. But seeing my mom broken like that, it made everything feel murky. Like maybe I was the villain in some twisted family drama. But the truth is, Rick did this to himself. And I wasn't going to let guilt trap me in the same cycle he had kept us both in for years. On day 20, he tried to retaliate. I came home to find my room trashed. Clothes everywhere. My laptop flipped upside down on the floor. A glass of water dumped over my desk chair. Nothing was stolen, it was purely a message. I walked straight into the garage. He was watching TV like nothing happened. You broke into my room. Prove it. I've got a camera in there now. He flinched. That's illegal. No, Rick. You entering a locked room and vandalizing my property is illegal. He didn't respond. I'm filing a police report, I said. You've got 10 days left. After that, you'll be removed by force. I turned and walked away. The next day, I installed a security system. Cameras outside. One in the hallway. One pointed at the garage entrance. Rick stayed quiet for a few days after that. Then, finally, day 30 came. He didn't pack. Didn't even pretend to. I had already filed the eviction paperwork. The court date was a formality, but I showed up. Rick didn't. The judge ruled in my favor in under 10 minutes. I paid for a constable to serve the writ of possession. The final notice was served on a Monday. Rick had 72 hours to leave. On Thursday morning, I came home from work and found him gone. Just like that. No note. No farewell. Just silence. A few beer cans in the garage and a pile of dirty clothes he couldn't be bothered to take. Mum didn't say much. She spent the day cleaning. Like, deep cleaning. Scrubbing corners. Wiping down baseboards. She said she needed to feel like the house belonged to her again. I think she meant her life. That night, we sat on the porch, not saying much. Just sipping tea and watching the sky turn orange. For the first time in a long time, the air felt still. Calm. I'm proud of you, she said quietly. I didn't know what to say. So I just nodded. The next morning, I found a Facebook post Rick had made. Some rant about ungrateful stepkids and how real men get stabbed in the back by their own family. Classic Rick. Playing the victim. Fishing for sympathy. I didn't comment. Didn't engage. I just blocked him. Because he was no longer part of this story. I was finally writing my own. Rick was gone. I'd imagined this moment more times than I could count. For years, I'd fantasized about the day he'd finally be out of my life, out of my house, out of my head. And now that it had happened, I thought I'd feel triumphant, powerful, free, victorious. But all I felt was tired. There was no parade. No lightning bolt of relief. Just a weird, echoing silence in the house, like it wasn't sure what to do with itself now that the biggest storm it ever hosted had finally passed. Mom barely talked for the first few days. She cleaned like a machine. I think it was her version of therapy, reclaiming her space one scrubbed counter at a time. She rearranged the living room twice, cleared out the garage, donated boxes of Rick's leftover junk to Goodwill without even looking inside them. I think if she could have bleached her memories, she would have. We talked here and there mostly about chores, bills, groceries. Neutral stuff. But something between us had shifted. We weren't just mother and son anymore. We were housemates. Allies. Survivors. Then, about a week later, I came home from work and found her in the kitchen, staring at a manila envelope. Certified mail came for you, she said, sliding it across the table. I opened it slowly, my stomach tightening as I read the sender, Law Office of Trent and Moore. Inside was a neatly typed letter, and just 3 lines in, I knew exactly who it was from. Rick. Apparently, he'd retained legal counsel, and was claiming he was wrongfully evicted from his place of residence without due process or reasonable accommodation. I almost laughed. His counsel, if you could call it that, was probably some free legal aid he guilt-tripped into sending a form letter. The language was vague and sloppy. But it was enough to stir the pot. I called my lawyer right away, scanned the letter, and sent it over. He read it, then immediately started chuckling. "Tell Rick thanks for the comedy," he said. "This isn't a lawsuit. This is a tantrum with a return address." I felt relieved, but I could tell Mom was shaken. She looked over the letter like it might bite her. "Does this mean he's coming back?" she asked softly. "No," I said. "It means he's grasping at straws. He's humiliated. He just wants to make noise." But she didn't look convinced. And honestly, neither was I. Because 2 days later, he showed up. I was coming home from the grocery store, bags in hand, when I saw him sitting on the front porch like nothing had ever happened. He looked worse than I remembered. Scruffier. Hollow. Like all the smugness had been wrung out of him and replaced with spite. I set the groceries down slowly. "What are you doing here?" I asked. He stood up, brushing dirt off his jeans. "I just want to talk." "You don't live here anymore, Rick. You're trespassing." "I'm not here to fight. I just want my stuff." I crossed my arms. "You left almost everything. And the stuff you did leave? It's gone." His face twitched. "You threw it away?" "No," I said. "Mom donated it. Weeks ago." He stepped forward. "You had no right." I stepped between him and the door. "You had 30 days. You spent them throwing tantrums in the garage. Not packing." He exhaled hard through his nose. "You're gonna regret this, kid." "Doubt it." Then, like clockwork, Mom pulled into the driveway. She saw him, froze, then climbed out slowly. She didn't say anything, just gave me a look, not panicked, but questioning. Like, "Should I step in, or will you handle it?" I nodded at her. Rick followed her gaze, then took a step back. "I'm not here to start anything," he said again, this time quieter. "Just thought maybe we could talk like adults. You should have done that before the cops were involved." He blinked. "You didn't have to do that. You made me look like a criminal. You did that to yourself." He stared at me for a long second, then walked off the porch without another word. He didn't even look at my mom. That was the last time I saw him in person. But it wasn't the last time I heard about him. Because apparently Rick had taken to spinning his own version of events to anyone who'd listen. He told his family, most of whom I barely knew, that I'd tricked him out of the house. That I'd forged the deed. That my mom was under my spell and being manipulated by a greedy little punk who wanted her husband gone. We started getting phone calls. Messages. One of Rick's cousins left a voicemail calling me a freeloader brat and saying I was lucky Rick didn't sue me for elder abuse. Which was hilarious, considering Rick was only 48. Mom didn't engage with any of it. She blocked numbers, deleted messages, and kept herself busy. But I could tell it was wearing her down. All that drama, all those whispers. Rick had turned his failure into a story, and like any good narcissist, he'd cast himself as the victim. Eventually, I got tired of it too. So I told the truth, once. I made a single post on Facebook. I kept it short. Simple. Just the facts. After years of emotional abuse, manipulation, and power games, I exercised my legal right to remove someone who made our home toxic. I own this house. Not because I wanted to, but because my grandfather trusted me to take care of my family, not enable someone who only took from it. I have no regrets. If you've only heard one side of the story, maybe it's time to consider the other. That post exploded. People who'd never interacted with me suddenly messaged saying, "I always wondered what was really going on over there." Extended family reached out, saying they'd heard rumors for years. Even a couple of Rick's own friends, guys who used to come over for beers and barbecue, messaged me privately to say, "I get it now." One even wrote, "Dude treated you like trash every time I was over." I always figured he was compensating for something. But the most surprising message came from someone I didn't expect at all. Rick's ex-wife. I didn't even know he had one until she messaged me. She thanked me for standing up to him. Said she divorced him for the same reasons. That he'd been a different man when they met, but the controlling, manipulative side had slowly bled out over time. She warned me, he doesn't stop. Just disappears until he finds someone else to latch onto. That shook me more than I expected. Because as much as I wanted Rick gone, There was a part of me, and maybe the stupid, soft part, that hoped he'd change. That maybe hitting rock bottom would wake him up. That maybe this whole thing would force him to look in the mirror. But he wasn't looking in mirrors. He was looking for someone else to blame. And I wasn't going to carry that burden anymore. A few weeks later, we finally started reclaiming the space in full. Mom painted the kitchen. I built a new desk for my room using lumber from the garage. We replaced the living room couch, the one Rick used to claim as his throne, and donated it with no fanfare. We even turned the garage into a real workshop again, with lights, tools, and an actual lock I had the key to. We were rebuilding. Slowly. Together. One night, Mom knocked on my door. I was thinking, she said, hesitating at the threshold. Maybe we should host Thanksgiving here this year. I blinked. Really? She nodded. We always went to Rick's cousin's place before. But I want to make new memories. Ones that actually feel good. I smiled. Yeah. Let's do it. And we did. We cooked together, burned the stuffing once, forgot the cranberry sauce, and somehow ended up with 2 turkeys. It was messy, loud, and imperfect. But it was ours. Our home. Our rules. No more tension. No more fear. No more walking on eggshells in a house full of yelling and slammed doors. Just quiet. Just peace. And for the first time in years, I finally felt like I could breathe. It's been a little over 3 months since Rick left, and even now, I'll catch myself bracing for his voice when I walk through the front door. Like my body hasn't fully accepted he's gone yet. But he is. He's gone. And life, real life, finally started moving forward once he was out of the picture. Mom's changed more than I expected. At first, she was like a balloon that had been deflated for so long, she didn't even remember what it felt like to be full. She was quiet, hesitant, second-guessing everything. But little by little, she started finding herself again. She dyed her hair for the first time in years. Started going on walks, reconnected with an old friend from high school, and even signed up for a pottery class. I know that sounds cliché, but it meant something, watching her take up space, explore hobbies, laugh again without flinching. She was becoming someone I'd never really met before, but always hoped she could be. One night, we were doing dishes together and she said, almost absently, "You know, I used to love music. But Rick hated when I played it loud. Said it gave him a headache." I handed her the dish towel and said, "What kind of music?" She grinned, then pulled out her phone and started blasting Fleetwood Mac in the kitchen. We danced like idiots, water splashing everywhere, and for a few minutes it felt like the air in the house itself had shifted, lighter, cleaner, freer. That moment stuck with me more than I thought it would. Because even though I had technically been the one to evict Rick, I realized my mom had evicted someone too, the version of herself that had lived under his thumb. We'd both reclaimed something. And maybe that's why what happened next hit me harder than it should have. It was a Saturday morning. I was cleaning out the attic, looking for some old board games my cousins wanted to play when they came over that night. I wasn't expecting to find anything important, just dusty boxes and Christmas decorations. But wedged behind one of the beams was a showbox I didn't recognize. Inside were letters. Dozens of them. All addressed to my mom. From my grandfather. Most were short, updates, stories, dad jokes, a few bits of advice. But tucked at the bottom was an envelope marked for my name, "When you're ready." My hand shook as I opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter. Neat cursive, the way only someone from his generation could write. It started like this. "If you're reading this, you've probably already found out the truth about the house. I hope it didn't come as too much of a shock." He explained everything, how he'd bought the house outright years ago, how he'd kept it in a trust under my name because he didn't trust Rick. How he tried to bring it up to my mom a few times, but Rick always made it difficult. He even mentioned that he saw the way Rick treated me, not in detail, but enough to know it wasn't right. "You were always sharper than you let on," he wrote. "I knew if anyone in this family was going to break the cycle, it'd be you." That sentence hit like a gut punch. He went on to say he didn't want to cause drama. That he didn't hate Rick, just didn't trust him to look after our family. He hoped that by leaving the house to me, I'd have something stable, something no one could take from me. I sat there in the attic for a long time, holding that letter. My grandfather had died 6 years ago. And somehow, he still managed to reach across time to say exactly what I needed to hear. Later that night, I showed the letter to my mom. She didn't say anything for a long time. Just held it to her chest, eyes closed. "I miss him," she whispered. "I miss who I was when he was around." I nodded. "He never stopped looking out for us." "Neither did you," she said. It felt like the final piece had clicked into place. Like something long unfinished had been completed. Rick wasn't gone forever. He still lingered in small, annoying ways. I found out he'd tried to move in with one of his buddies, but that fell apart within weeks. Word was, he was couch surfing between family members. Always down on his luck, always the victim. He sent my mom a long text one night, some pity-filled rant about missing her, wanting to talk, and how he was ready to be a man again. She showed it to me. Then she blocked him. We didn't even discuss it. No argument. No hesitation. Just blocked. That was her closure. For me, mine came a few weeks later when I finally turned the spare bedroom, the one Rick used to claim as his office, into something else. My own studio. I'd been working on digital art in my free time, something I used to love before Rick started mocking it. Waste of time, he'd say. No one makes a living doodling. That always stuck with me, and for a while, I believed him. But now? I turned that room into a creative space. New desk. Tablet. Good lighting. I posted some of my stuff online, joined some forums, started taking small commissions. The first time someone paid me $40 for a custom piece, I almost cried. Because it wasn't just about the money. It was about reclaiming parts of myself that I buried to keep someone else comfortable. We all have our Rick, someone who makes you shrink, apologize, second guess. Someone who benefits from your silence and fears your growth. And sometimes, you don't even realize how much of yourself you've lost to that person until they're gone. But once they are, you get to build. Not just a house. A life. A version of yourself that doesn't flinch when the door opens. That doesn't brace for the next insult. That doesn't need permission to breathe freely in your own home. It took me 18 years to get here. But I'm here. And I'm not going back.